Okay, just a few words of introduction in terms of the GPS, I guess I would say. Um, I'm a what I found, I guess I should say, when I was editor of the German Postal Specialist in the 90s, was that Germany is an incredibly huge field for collectors. Because you've got old state collectors and you've got the modern stuff, the wars, all of those kinds of things. So we're a bunch of folks who can't quite make up our minds what we collect and how much of it we collect. Right now we're at about 680, 690 members. And we have a very strong Third Reich study group and several other study groups. So anybody who, studies some aspect of German postal history or philately can probably find others who collect similar materials. Paul and I had talked about what to discuss, and so I came up with a censorship because I produced this about 3-4 years ago and hadn't looked at it very much. I did it for my own local chapter, and I thought I would present an introduction because you can really get into the weeds on this thing. And so this is truly an introduction. It will focus on two of the big censorship stations, the first one an early one, and the second one the largest of the censorship stations. One of the reasons also to select this is probably most of you have at one time or another seen censored mail, because a lot of this came to this country prior to our entry into the Second World War in December of '41. So let's start. Do I need to say Bing or something? There we go. And here's the first blooper in that first line. Censorship is obviously not a new thing. And it was practiced early, but during World War II, of course, virtually every country had censorship of. I'm going to go through a very short history of censorship from the German point of view. Then let's talk a little bit about German censorship plans, then basic methods, and then the first censorship stations, Berlin and Karnigsberg, because they'll give you a representative view. And then finally, a look at the expanded system. Next. Why censorship? And I think this is translated from a German source: to paralyze, enemy spying, sabotage, propaganda, and obviously then to gather information. So the Germans were really keen on this. There is some evidence that they actually occasionally got some information, but I'm never quite clear how much that was. And we really do not have very many or very much documentation about the censorship establishment itself, or what kind of information they ever garnered, in part because most of these censorship stations ultimately had to be moved because of bombardments, or the materials were simply lost or destroyed. Next. Here is just an example of early censorship. Here, Boer War, going to Germany, and you can see opened under martial law. Next. Here's World War One, back one. Okay, nope. Go back. There.
There you go, Rudi. Sorry about that.
No problem. Obviously, there was censorship during First World War. As you can see, this is a US cover going back to Germany. Remember, we didn't enter the war until 17, so there was mail. There were mail options. This happened to be a French censor, and you'll find this. So as American collectors, obviously, one can also collect it from that perspective. Next.
Rudy, can I ask a quick question as
Sure.
you're going through this, just for the
Absolutely.
audience? Well, I presume some of these have contents, and if so, you would mention that, and you would then know from the contents that clearly these are mostly personal correspondence or business, right? Is that true?
Yes. And of course, people were watching. I mean, people were told that there was censorship, certainly in Germany, and I think on this country too, that there was censorship and they needed to be careful what they said. And if the censor caught material, in the German case, they would either send it back with a warning or simply destroy it. So they made short rift of it, I guess. So
Thank you. Thank you for that.
here in World War I think, and towards the end of the war again, the German military had control of censorship, and censorship was fairly much more localized during the First World War for the Germans, and was under direct control, I think, of military commanders on the various fronts. So you'll see all kinds of different labels. Some of this is interesting. It's harder to come by this material than later stuff. Next. We have something here tape that was used for currency and control. Frequently, this stuff is viewed as censorship. That's wrong. The purpose was not censorship. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they immediately clamped down because they didn't want anything valuable coming in or out of the country, for that matter, without them seeing what it was. So you have a great deal of this kind of opening of mail, but it's primarily to view, look for currency or stamps or whatever. Next. The initial German plans were pretty thin. They had proposed or had thought about having a censorship station in the east, in the eastern part of the country, Karnigsberg, Kaliningrad today, and they had thought of Berlin. Well, the amount of mail that was going between Germany and other countries was really pretty large. So they created what are called these Auslandsbriefprüfstellen, foreign lenses, and here I just have the abbreviations, but this is what you'll see them referred to. Basically, you have a number of foreign letter censorship stations. Then you have letter censorship stations. Those tended to be more on non-German soil, in other words, in occupied areas. And I added here Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, which the High Command of the Armed Forces, they were initially, until 1944, in control of all of the censorship activities. But those are just definitions. Go on. Next one. The mechanics. Prüfstempel is essentially a canceling device. Most of these canceling devices were rubber. Most of the time you'll see these in blues or reds, I guess frequently in reds. In this instance, I think this is an early one, and you have Auslandsbriefprüfstelle. Germans like to squeeze words together. So that's foreign letter examination place. And in the bottom, you can see Königsberg, and then in parentheses, PR, which stands for Preußen, right? So identifying the actual location. Later on, that's dropped, and Königsberg becomes A, and you'll see that in a minute. And then Berlin becomes B, Cologne, C, and D for Munich. So they had an alphabet system. And the piece of the handout that I included lists all of these as a handy dandy guide for you to kind of quickly identify what you're looking at if you have some of these. Go on, next one.
Hey, Rudi, quick question again here. So literally every piece of mail coming and going was opened and censored. Is that really
well,
at the end of the day?
almost. It would be rare that it isn't. I'll show you some examples that weren't. But the idea was clearly to censor every piece of mail. And the aim was to have that piece of mail processed in one day.
Wow.
Now that's amazing. But for starters, I'll say this now, and I guess we can repeat later, is for instance, the Berlin censorship station employed 2,000 censors, and that's not counting the military staff was there, and then various kinds of workers who did lifting and sealing and everything. Those 2,000 censors were largely women with language skills. And of course, that was no different than what we had in the United States or the UK. Lots of the censors themselves were women, and that made sense for several reasons, because that meant men could be free to do other things. And of course, you had people who had language skills that were required. So I guess that's enough at this point, but that gives you some notion of the size of these operations. And that's, if you read on like the Bermuda censorship of the British, you also get similar numbers of at least 1,000 or more censors employed.
Thank you, Rudi.
Verschluss means simply seal. These are paper seals. And again, these are the mechanics of this thing. Initially, the Berlin station didn't even have seals. They quickly made some up. And you'll see with Karnigsberg, initially they didn't have anything. So they really, you can't say they were prepared for war in the sense they made provisions that they figured they needed to censor mail, but they really hadn't set up anything in any specific way. The top example shows there's no indication here, just says opened by the military, right? Oberkommando, OKW, and geprüft means proofed or examined. Below the strip says geöffnet, opened, right? And it's slightly different. You have an alpha underneath, which is a small b, and then you have the red cancels that match up, if you notice, with the insignia on the mailing strip. You'll always find that. So in this case, this is a typical Berlin kind of strip later on. Next. You also had pass-through cancellations. In other words, there was a lot of mail that could either be read without opening, like postcards of some kind or another, and mail deemed not significant enough, so it was just passed through without the censor really looking at it very closely. On the one hand, here on the left, you have that AB, so the small b indicates Berlin, and then of course the large A indicates Auslandsprüfstelle. And then you have the red censor cachet, in this case, both Berlin, and just smacked on there. And on the right card there, you also have an LB. We're not sure what the L meant, but these indicate that this went through an expedited process. You could take a card directly to an office and have a censor immediately process it. So businesses did this a lot. So those are a little less frequently seen with the L designations. Next. These are just other examples. On the left, machine cancels, just ran it through. If they had it, they ran it through just to indicate it had been there. Whether how closely they examined this would depend. On the right, for printed matter, you again have a big rubber stamp with the A, B, again, Berlin. And, you know, it was probably a newspaper wrapper or something like this. So that simply is another indication. But you'll see this kind of material, I think, frequently in dealer boxes. Next. You also have what we call proofer cancels with individual identity marking. So I think my title here is bad, but I'm not sure if you can see well enough, but you'll see a bunch of scribbles on this cover on the lower left and somewhere towards the right. This is pretty common on for most censorship stations. Sometimes they had rubber stamps, but many times they just had little notes they put on. By the way, if you have a cover with letters, if you looked at each letter, you would have also seen those same identifying markings on the page of each letter, each of the pages of the letter.
I have a question, Rudi, as well. So do these individual censors also have to keep a log book of everything that they looked at and censored and documented all? I mean, you know, we know they documented everything. Were
Right.
they also doing that at every single letter coming through?
No, I think the way the process worked, they had about 10 stations in all of this. There was, for instance, the initial station was a segregation. You know, is this business mail? Is it civilian mail, right?
Okay, yep.
Or is it specific? In other words, is it patent related? And that was the initial separation of mail. Once you got through that, then it went to the specific censors who took care of that. You would have a group, simple job they had is opening that letter. And of course, I think with some of that, they would make a mark. And then it would be forwarded to someone, and you'd have a reader, and then you would have ultimately possibly a second reader, and then a sealing group, and then various other groups involved in this.
But no ledgers, no formal ledgers where they would actually document it for.
Not that we're aware of.
Okay.
Now, they did some things, for instance, and we'll see in a minute. Show the next slide. Maybe we can see one there. Here's an example of where in Munich, for instance, they had, it seemed like everybody who touched the letter had a little rubber marking. On the top one, for instance, you'll see that the nice blue wave on there was, of course, a chemical test, right? For secret writing inks. You'll see those a lot. You see the seal on that one is at the top, which is they used a special machine that crimped the paper and then ran a printed information on the top of that one. But you've got two little boxes with 4 letters. You've got a circle with a 72. The next card down, you've got 2 boxes. You've got a G, you got 17, and you got a 5. And the next one down has, I think, 5 numbers. But to the left of that, you have a green 6-digit number, which probably indicates registry. They did separately for a while note registry with an ID number, essentially. And then like the bottom one again. So it's amazing how much latitude each of these stations had, because Munich loved this kind of stuff, but Berlin hardly ever did that. And when we go through the individual censorship stations, you'll see there are significant differences amongst those stations. Next. You also, of course, had instances, I think you referred to them, you know, if there were violations. This happens to be a cachet, and the simple thing here is this thing was obviously found in the mailbox, and it's a warning that the mail has to be handed in and brought to the post office. But note some of the other little notations. On the lower right, you'll see at least two numbers, a 3-digit, a 4-digit number, and then also a green number, a sequential number of some kind, and the little pencil scribbles. So you know right there that at least, you know, 4 entities looked at this, and of course somebody also put that rubber cachet on there, warning of what's going on there. Next. Some of the rules, okay, deliver at the counter, and then of course standard, illegible writing, no secret languages, inks, no lined envelopes. If you see some of the envelopes, you'll see that the lining has been torn out. That's pretty standard. No picture postcards is always very interesting, and frequently you'll see warnings about that. No non-business printed matter, okay? Maximum of 4 pages, name and address of sender and recipient on each page. Stamp trading was not desired, but I have, you know, documentation inside the process from a Norwegian Stamp Federation, for instance, all kinds of rules about how to trade stamps with Germany and other countries within the Axis purview. So this was going on. I mean, there are still stamp dealers. You can't keep stamp collectors out of this entirely. They tried what they could. Sometimes material was obviously not passed through. Finally, of course, you obviously had to say nothing about the economic situation, food or bombing or anything else that might be construed as sabotage or unpatriotic. Next. The other way of noting this in this case, they would insert these little slips of paper. In this case, you know, it simply said, sender must not just be an, address must be on every page and so on. There are literally dozens of these kinds of scraps of paper from every censorship station. Again, there was no uniformity. Sometimes they're fancy like this. Other times they were typewritten. Sometimes they were little check boxes. Again, no uniformity, certainly amongst them. But these, I should note here, you notice the sealing strip and you also see the machine sealing or machine cachet, the red seal on top of that. So again, those were unique steps. Somebody put in the seal over the cut that had been made on the envelope and then ran it through a machine to get the red seal.
Rudi, I mean, this just to me is amazing that you'd have this much touching of material and the censors checking the censors, checking the censors.
Yep.
Almost, that's what it seems like, right? That it's just
It is
overkill.
absolutely right. You got it. You hit the nail on the head. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make sure I'm interpreting this right because this is a bit of a new area for me. I mean, I've got some sense.
No, and I think
it's overkill, right?
Yeah, some of this is done also like in Bermuda. I mean, there were multiple censors. People, you had to organize it when you're dealing with huge volumes of mail and trying to make sure nothing, problematic got through. Sometimes I wonder, given what they got out of it, how much it was worth doing this. I mean, the amount of resources expended for this sometimes seems a little excessive, so.
Agreed. Thank you for sharing that.
Next. Let's start with Karnigsberg. Here's the first. Karnigsberg was essentially the first functioning entity, the first Auslandsbriefprüfstelle, right? and it's improvised, right? You have a little red thing, I mean, a little blue thing here, von der Wehrmacht zugelassen, permitted by the military, right? You've got a cachet on the right there. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see what's on back. Again, they don't have a pre-printed sealer. And then this says im Staatsinteresse zugelassen, allowed per interest of, opened rather in the interest of state. And another one of these cachets, and this again, as I've showed before, was Königsberg, Preußen, right? So they're identifying the place where this is happening, and think about all the different people who, what they've done here. They've had at least several markings indicating what happens. Not very efficient, quite frankly. Next. By late 39, they got their act together a little bit better. They have a red cachet here, and you can faintly see that in the bottom of this, you still have the city's name, Königsberg, Preußen, there. Card going to Estonia, right? Tallinn. As you will see from the handout, Königsberg was essentially set up to control the mail to the Finland and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the USSR. So it was basically that end of Europe that it controlled. And that's, like I said, when you see my little handout, you'll see that these stations controlled specific areas. Those areas unfortunately changed over time and can't always be relied upon. But if you have a letter, obviously in 39 going to Latvia, it's going to have most likely been canceled in Königsberg. Next.
Hey, Rudy, before you go, can you go back?
Yeah.
Was that postcard originally Polish before it was, that information was blocked out?
Which information are you talking about?
Where it says postcard, the information below it has been X'd out.
Oh, yeah.
And also the vertical right down the middle has been, something's been X'd out.
Right. You got it correct. And this is December. So by December, I don't know if I'd have to look at the original to tell you, well, what is it? I can't quite read the...
It just looks like it's Polish.
Yeah. So it
would have been 3 months after the...
right. 3 months after Poland. This kind of stuff would be done.
Yeah, it's what, POCZTOWKA, right? So that's what's underneath the hatching.
Yes.
Right,
Yep.
right.
I think that's Polish.
Yeah, I think it
Right,
is.
no, it's a Polish card. Yeah, or was a Polish card. I
Yeah,
guess.
it was. Thank you.
Next. Okay, here you're at 41. By 41, of course, the Russians had taken the Baltic countries, and here you have, a card coming in, and a similar cachet, red cachet, but you'll note on the bottom of it, you no longer see Königsberg, you see a small a. And like most of this, you'll get this is the quickest way that, the initial way that I would identify any of those. Look for the little alpha usually at the bottom of those cachets. That'll immediately tell you where it was done. This is 41. So you have this evolution of responsibility, I guess, is what I'd say.
Rudy, what's in the banner in that saying cancel at the top above that?
Yeah, I think it's censored.
Ah, okay, got it.
Yeah, and like I said, there was no uniformity here.
Right,
I mean,
right. They're all over the
and
place.
that makes that, and if you have the sources, and I indicate the primary sources there, if you have the sources, we can talk about this later, but I mean, basically, you literally have, like Königsberg alone, you probably have at least a dozen different, of these kinds of caches. And they vary. It depends where's the eagle pointing to. In this case, you have the right eagle wing is pointing to the H. Okay. Now in another cancel, it may be pointing to the M. So I mean, it's this kind of level of differentiation. So in the catalogs or the books themselves, you'll find many devices, and they obviously created them as they needed them as things wore out, and they thus you have the variety there. Next. Here is a later Königsberg. Here you have a Durchlauf, a pass-through cancellation, a very weak. Again, you can see rubber wears out. Here's an AA, right? Auslands, and then the little A there. And it's through Deutsche Dienstpost Ostland. Remember, the Baltics became, after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, the Baltics were occupied by the Germans, and it became Ostland. So if you look at the stamp closely, you have the Ostland overprint there. And of course, you also have a typewritten thing on there, Deutsche Dienstpost Ostland. And generally, these things were from German businesses back to Germany, back and forth. But the Dienstpost served as sort of an extra security type mail. So they didn't look at that as closely as they might with other materials. I mean, it's more likely to be basically business mail. Next.
Hey, Jeffrey, could you please mute your line because you keep coming in with static, and we just want to make sure Rudi can just speak unencumbered. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Now let's turn to Berlin. Berlin in 39, as I said, they weren't prepared. So the war starts on the 1st of September, as you know, and the stealth attack on Poland. They really had no sealing tape, separate sealing tape, or for that matter, caches. So they continued to use, in this instance, these currency control strips. And the problem then becomes, for something like this is this just currency control, i.e. the customs people just looked at this, or is it censorship? Now this is dated 14th of October, so one might surmise that it's probably censorship, and the censors are using that tape because it's handy. Frequently, the customs people and the censorship people were close to one another or attached to a significant post office. But don't assume automatically this is censorship. You'll have to look at the date and kind of figure that out. The next slide will show you what happened occasionally. This is a rather tattered item, but you'll note two things. You'll see that the currency folks, the customs folks, opened it and sealed it with a customs label, and then the censor folks came along and they used their own opened it a second time and stuck a tape. This happens to be, I think, I'm trying to look at the bottom of the thing. It's an E, so it's Frankfurt. I just threw it in here to indicate that this kind of thing might happen occasionally. You're never sure, but it's going to the United States, so the customs people would have also been interested in this, as well as the censors themselves. So you have this evolution here. And by this time, obviously, Berlin already has a sealing strip and has its own cachet. Next. And sometimes you don't have censorship. And this goes to the good doctor's question earlier. Was it all censored? Sometimes things slipped through. I could see no evidence on this letter. This is a standard, 65 pfennig airmail rate. This is when, by the route, from Portugal to the United States. And I don't know why on November 21, it's a good 3 months into the war, it's not censored, but it's clearly not censored. So that's a possibility. Again, looking at the dates becomes important. Next. I think I showed this one earlier, sealing tapes, geprüft. These were Berlin, but there's no indication in those tapes. The slight difference here, and again, this is for the aficionados, right? You notice on the lower tape, you have little black line markings there in the center, and on the upper one, you don't. You'll also notice it's a standard length of tape. The line markings were for if you opened the letter on top or bottom, you could fold the label and paste it down that way. On the top, you'll notice that there's still signs of where the letter was opened and the seal didn't quite cover that opening. But again, there are dozens of these kinds of labels, and collectors obviously also differentiate among these.
Rudi, a quick question. So these labels were just out of a tape dispenser, I presume, and would become standard size, and these were already gummed?
We're not clear. I think some of them clearly were, must have been. Others, I have seen no real evidence of a lot of gum slopping around. You know what I mean? They
Yes.
were probably. However, later in the war, you'll see lots of improvised. They'll run out of these labels and they'll use other pieces of paper to do it. So clearly
Thank
there
you.
were times when, they used what they had.
Absolutely. It is a war, right? And so
Right.
if you're doing this at the volume they're doing it at, they would have to just improvise when they ran out of whatever material.
Right. And sometimes the interesting stuff is when censor tape from one station is used at another station. But again, that gets into the weeds. Next. Here by 1940, and here I've used the markings or the designations when I say sealing strip B51 and a cancel of B2A. Those are designations in the catalogs. And I feature those, I'll talk about those catalogs a little bit. This is kind of typical for Berlin because Berlin was designated as the place for via Siberia mail coming and going. So we'll see this for some US mail, but you'll also see it for Central American and South American mail. The effort was to avoid British censorship. This is 1940. The British are censoring in Bermuda, so go around the other way, go via Siberia. And then also you'll see references to circumventing Canada. So you get it to Alaska and then you get it into the United States and maybe then to Washington, D.C. In this case, this is clearly business mail to Goldman Sachs and Company, right? And a mere 25 pfennig, which was not an airmail rate, it was a simple surface rate.
So is then that a favor? I mean, to be able to do that kind of mail to Goldman Sachs from that part of the world for that
Yeah,
low
I
of a
mean,
rate?
I have no idea how long it took to get there.
Yeah.
But obviously, trying to avoid the British censors was not inconsequential for folks. So, next, here another one similar, and I think the only thing here is to note you've got a sequential number on this one. You also required people who handed in the business mail to actually sign with their name on it. The other little difference on this is you notice the label there, the two German cachets. This was opened differently. And then the word Einlieferer, i.e., that's the person who actually brought it into the post office. Sometimes you'll have a printed return address, but then added again the exact person who brought it in, because they, just in case you were faking it, right? You had to show identity papers that you were the actual person who you say you are, and you're really doing real business mail. So next. Here, just a machine. This is to indicate from Berlin, a paper. They had a kind of a device that crimped the paper. You've probably seen this too, and it runs on the left-hand side for opening. And what you'll see is OKW, of course, you know what that is. And then the Nazi eagle with the swastika insignia there. And then you'll see the lowercase b. So that tells you right away, this is Berlin. Again, to affirm.
So Rudi, a quick question on this, because that doesn't look like it's a label. I know you're saying it's crimped. So it goes through the machine, it gets crimped at that end, which puts that pattern
Yeah,
in,
and they
holds it
print,
closed, and then
they-
you got a second pass to print on the OKW?
right. I don't know if the device did both steps at once.
Aha.
It
Okay.
seems to be that it did. It seems to me it's fairly regular, and it seems to be that they must have done it in one step.
So they knew how to be efficient when they had to be. This was one
Right.
example. Everything else
Right.
they did was kind of inefficient.
Yeah,
But this
and
was an
I think-
evolution. Okay.
Yeah, they didn't need much glue on these things. I think these things almost hold together because of the way it's almost like they punched the paper a bit
Yes,
and
absolutely.
get it to hold together. But you'll
Okay.
see this again at various censoring facilities. Next.
Thank you.
Here, I just want to show you the typical Berlin note. The Berlin cachet generally has BB on the underneath, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, right? Then you got the eagle there, and the swastika in the middle, on the right and the left, a B. This is fairly standard. And then you have a very curious wavy little sideway S that's there. And that's kind of the telltale mark for Berlin. You'll see that in many of their cachets, and they had literally dozens, more than several dozen of these cachets. And again, they're differentiated by where the wings of the eagle are, how that little sideways S tilts. I'm not making this up. I mean, they've got 6 different types of how that little sideways thing looks. But this is sort of an easy way of quickly telling. This is to Switzerland. And again, why is this going through Berlin instead of Munich? Because it's I'm trying to ignore that. It's a patent. It's patent related. So that's why that's happening.
Hey, Rudy, were
Yeah.
those hand stamps traceable back to an individual person?
Not that we're aware of. The little 225 or whatever there is,
Yeah.
you notice there, or whatever that number is, and one right at the top.
Yeah, that's 254.
This one, yeah, and the little pencil markings, those would have traced back to a specific person doing the work.
Okay.
Um,
Thanks.
but these caches, no, they're not traceable to individuals. The other things we presume are individual actual persons. Next. Okay, here's a slight variant on this, and it's probably not because I'm trying to replace this. This has a big T on top of the head of the eagle, if you see there, and it's very faint here, but you'll see the B, the Berlin, and I think it's very faint that you might have the sideway S, but it's just another variety. And the suspicion is that it was to designate transit mail, i.e. this is mail going from France to Stockholm, right? So it's just passing through Germany, but they're looking at it in any case. So next. Here, Berlin, the reason I threw this in, Berlin-Hof, you'll see these markings, and Berlin got bombed out late in the war, and Berlin had been responsible for mail communications between German prisoners of war and German internees. In this case, I think somebody who was in Lordsburg, New Mexico. But you have an H on each side of this. So Berlin shifted this responsibility to the city of Hof, which is, you know, the Thuringia, near what became the border of East and West Germany and Bavaria. So it used to be that we didn't see Hof as a separate station, but it only functioned for a fairly limited amount of time. And again, we don't know even the exact dates on when this shift took place. But I thought this was kind of a nice card. This is Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, the Silent Night, Holy Night, right? It's a card that was obviously produced, and it was, you see the bottom of it, the YMCA obviously gave the POWs some money or some way of producing this Christmas greeting card. That was
the other thing I see, Rudy, is if I'm seeing it right on my screen, there's a U.S. censor at the lower left marking too.
Oh, it should be. Absolutely. Right? Because it's coming from the U.S., right?
Yep.
So that would have been the first censor is the U.S. censor. And then, of course, what's the POW writing back home? The Germans would be very interested that he doesn't say something that he shouldn't be saying. So.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Next. Late censorship, and I think the only reason I threw this in, the cache changes, and it changes largely because in 44, you may recall, there was the attempted assassination of Hitler, and that caused big distrust between Hitler and the military, and it allowed Himmler to essentially take over the censorship function. And that then created a whole new set of, it's no longer OKW, you know, the armed forces, they'll have Zensurstelle, right, or zensiert, but you still have that B and you still have that little sideway S, or the Germans call it a tilde, tilt little signature. So this is essentially late in the war. Next. Pass-through censor. Here you have, you know, again, an AB standard, as we saw with AA for Karnigsberg. Next. Other pass-through would normally be diplomatic mail. In this case, Panamanian Republic. So generally, they did not open that, although I found some that's been opened. But here you have a good indication of the registry label, and you'll see the 6-digit number. They were tracking, the registry in this way. They had numerator kind of stamping devices, I guess, that did that. And you see the small AB on the left side, the pass-through sensor. Next. Other ABs, censorship, and sometimes we're actually applied to paper strips. It went through the only thing I'm showing here is essentially that after they put on the label, they ran it through another machine that printed very faintly, in this case, a cachet on it. But it also has the pass-through censorship. So what is it? I mean, why does one person say this is pass-through, and then they open it anyway, and you never quite know why something is done. You can sort of surmise what might have happened.
So then, Rudi, is the blue C on the front next to the address Illinois not part of the censorship? And was
sure, it
that
is.
Struck
It's part of the
US?
censorship, but we have no idea
Okay.
whether that referred to a specific person or a specific operation. This is early. Remember, we're still going to the US, so it's early on.
Mhm.
And the most desirable pieces, let me just step aside a minute. The most desirable pieces in this kind of stuff that you can get is when censorship stations screw up. Something should have gone to Munich, but it went to Berlin, or something should have gone to Königsberg or wherever, right? So then it ends up being canceled by several stations. Not quite sure what happened, but screw-ups are desirable. And I suppose that goes for stamps and, all kinds of stuff that makes collecting more interesting. So next. Here, this is just thrown in because, again, a surface mail, LB, this was, for the Reichsbahn, and all it indicates. And by the way, these LBs, you'll have little letters in the bottom, which again indicates there were dozens of different ones. Just indicates that it was hand delivered to a specialty censor place so that it got expedited surface. On the left, you'll also see it was also examined probably by the British. You see the examiner there of the strip there. Next. Just another example of from Switzerland, from business mail, an LB, and here you can see the 4A, which again probably might have referenced the specific, desk. We're not sure. Again, next. Finally, infractions of the rules could also result in a little piece of little label being smacked on top. In this case, the labels said, return the sender. Obviously, it's been mostly torn off because it went back. We're not sure in some of these instances whether this was actually done by the censor or the post office. Frequently, the post office, in order to make sure mail went through, if they saw that you as a sender had screwed something up, they would send it back to you first to make a correction. The other thing you'll see here, which was supposed to be done all the time, is you note there's a actual cancel of the 40 Pfennig and the 4 Pfennig stamp. But then on the left-hand side, you have another cancel. And that was sort of to be a double check in the post office so that possibly the censor could actually see which post office could clearly read the sending post office's, cancel, so that they could track a piece of mail back, i.e. what clerk at what counter actually stamped this thing, right, or allowed it to go through. So next. This, now we step away from, the two specific examples. I want to just give you a very quick overview of the major censorship stations. On the left-hand side, you'll see the alphabetics. And to the right of Karnigsberg, I've also noticed Gestapo. I'm not going to talk anything about Gestapo, but the Gestapo had its own system of checking suspected person's mail, okay? And they had their own canceling devices. We're not sure whether they were in the regular censorship operations or part of those, but the Gestapo then had not alphas, but they had numbers. Gestapo at Königsberg was 5, Berlin 1, and there you see the numbers. This map shows the various major stations that we're going to just very briefly look at. And I'm not sure how good this map is for you. Obviously, Berlin, you can see kind of in the center. Königsberg is there. There you got Königsberg, and each of them have their things. So first we'll look at the stations that were inside the German Reich and then the ones that were outside. Next. Here we have Cologne in 39. It was open from 39 to 44. Different caches. This is not a good example, but you'll see all kinds of little box numbers and other numbers. And it's the label itself has a C underneath the swastika. But the other difference in the actual cache is that the cache will have a C under the swastika, but also a number. Why they did this, I have no idea. Again, this just shows you. Next. Again, here's a pass-through, an AC there, but then you'll see the little box 60 there. This is 44, November of 44. So this is pretty late for, Cologne, because I think they got bombed out and then they were moved to some little rural village and continued. But you don't exactly know that because they still can use the AC designation. Next. Munich had the D. This is a letter from Italy. And notice here on the right-hand side, you'll see the D underneath the swastika. You won't see the D in the actual cache, the blue on the left, but you'll see at least 5 different markings here. A D, a 12, a 20, and a 2001 and 2020. So Munich was creative in that way. So a whole bunch of people did something with this piece of mail. Next. Again, the fun of Munich here. A nice example here in both instances of the paper seal on the left with a D, the chemical sensor marking, and the various kinds of box numbers. And on the right, on the upper image, you'll see a P, and below that you'll see a little, what looks like a flower. And that's a popular one. I don't know, somebody got creative and decided that was their marking, and then the 38. So again, in some sense, if you can't read, but you see how even those markings are on the OKW with the sealing. They always come pretty much, so that's usually what makes me think
Yeah, so Rudi, I was going to say that as well. Now that I see these two examples to what you showed before, that is absolutely looks consistent, like it was done at the same time, right?
Yeah,
It really does seem, you know, pretty
yeah.
automated.
And
One pass.
yeah, we have no evidence. I mean, we have simply no knowledge, I think. Reamer, who wrote the first book on this, pulled together stuff and interviewed people, but we have very little actual knowledge of how these places operated or equipment they had. Next. Late censorship here. The only reason I'm showing this, again, you still have the D in the red cachet. This time you also have a little thing underneath because now you're under Himmler. And you have a card here that's going to Italy from a forced laborer from an Italian camp, Italienisches Lager at Dessau. And above the cachet, you'll also see Werk Nord there. That's part of the identification of the labor camp. Obviously, the Germans had these camps all over Germany. And note here, this is 27th of February, 45. So, they continued. And on the lower right, you've got the 7185 marking there. So next. Frankfurt was a standard one for transatlantic mail. You'll see this very frequently. The thing to note here, and I think the thing that any collector of this material might find interesting, is that the Germans, of course, required persons of Jewish heritage to identify themselves as such. So in this case, you will have the insertion of the name Israel, i.e. it's a forced middle name of Israel, or Sarah if a woman. And this, there are debates as to when this was forced. Early in the war, that wasn't required, and you'll see it only, I think, most of the time in late 40 and 41, where it's an actual requirement for Jews to identify themselves in this way. Next. Transit mail, pure and simply, Frankfurt, and the cachet. You'll notice the tape. I don't know if you've been paying attention. Tapes is slightly different again. Cachet is E, little boxed things again. Nothing unusual about this one. Next. Hamburg, F. Again, Hamburg was to examine materials going basically to the Scandinavian countries, right? The sealing tape shows the F. Can't see on the cachet the F, but you'll notice that you have an A at the bottom here, A and a Roman 3. You've got a 0010 there. You've got some pencil marking, and I think you got a little 25 on the back side of it. Again, who knows what, but it's obviously going from Norway to Switzerland. Next. Pass-through AF, that's a simple one, of course, that you can tell. Again, business mail. This is going from, and this makes this interesting. I mean, this makes is, going to Denmark from Germany. So it goes right through Hamburg and, there. So it's less likely to be a problem since it's business mail, so they pass it through. Next. Vienna receives G, and frequently on Vienna stuff you'll see the actual cachet, the red cachet, have the little rim on the top, G beneath the sealing tape, beneath the swastika. but you'll also notice all kinds of other markings on the front side. You'll see these counter numbers here at the very top. It's coming from Zagreb. Vienna was responsible basically for the Balkans, mail through the Balkans. Yeah. Next. Vienna Passthrough here for something completely different, have some Gothic lettering. I think that's the only example of Gothic lettering that I've found. All the others, you know, don't use this kind of a thing, but somebody got creative and did that. Next. Copenhagen, K. And what's interesting about this, of course, Denmark was occupied. In this case, in Denmark, they continued to use paper seals that were Danish. So you'll see paper seals, and you'll also see a red cachet, which still features the crown, the Danish crown in the center. But this is under German censorship. And this is, of course, going from Denmark up to Sweden. So that's why, you know, between the countries, those kinds of things set up. Next. Here you have a clear saying German K canceled. You'll see the K in the red marking there, and using the Danish, again, using the Danish. And here you've got a letter from Sweden that's probably going to Denmark. Next. Oslo, 1944. Many times the late tapes are just awful to read. The quality is bad, but this is late enough that quality really begins to show, or bad quality.
Is that July of 44? I mean, that's late, right?
Right. Well, actually, I've got some
Well,
later ones coming up. If you look at the next one, next slide here, this is 10th of April, 45. And you'll see, note that the paper strip now on the side is just a piece of paper, right? Nothing printed, and an AO. So they use a pass-through sensor, but they open it still because they don't apparently have another device. So it's opened, but they are taking a piece of mail from Norway to Sweden and looking at it. So in April 45, I guess it's a job, right?
Yeah, they're improvising, right? Just to make sure they do that and push it
Right.
through any way they can. Yep, absolutely.
Interestingly, that one was also in Trondheim, but it was not, the censor was not done in Trondheim, however, which I find interesting. And I'll say about that more in a couple of minutes here. Next. Durchlauf. In this case, who knows? They have both the pass-through sensor of Oslo and of Copenhagen on one. Now, why? You know, I suppose they're just saying, yeah, we saw this cover, but we didn't do anything with it. So that's kind of a fun item when you have two censoring stations put something on a letter. Next. Here, Leon is a fairly scarce station. The station didn't open until fairly late. It was going, you know, between France and Switzerland. Because of its location later on, the function was moved to Nancy. But you'll see the L in the bottom here of, again, the quality becomes a problem. Going to the Red Cross, obviously. So, you know, and you have lots of this kind of mail. Unfortunately, you won't find many L sensors. So if you've signed one, you've got a better one with the L. Next. Trondheim. Now here, these are scarce. Trondheim was the smallest censoring station. If you know something about European geography, you know Trondheim is way up in Norway. And obviously the reason for that was that mail going to Sweden didn't have to travel all the lengths down the country and go over that way. It has a T in the label, you'll see. Interestingly enough, it doesn't, you'll see the T there, but it also has one of those sideways little tilde things, one of those little sideway squiggles there, which you might think is Berlin, but it's not. So you can, a faint T in the bottom and the T in here. But if you pick up a sensor, I mean a Trondheim sensor, give me a call, I'll buy it from you. I'll give you.
All right, everybody make a note. Rudy's buying. Go look
No,
in your collection,
I'm serious.
folks.
If you find one, those are generally good. Next, Paris censorship, and Paris had the designation of X. So you'll see the X label. Notice that this is going to Canada, and notice this is. I'm not sure in 43 how this happened, but apparently it could, because it's examined by the Canadians. I think as has Canadian receiving mark. The X is in the bottom underneath the swastika, and the cachet itself, notice the X on both sides. Next. The standard X that you'll see, and you'll see tons of this stuff, is out of Algeria, and it's a pass-through cancel from Paris, AX, and there are a dozen varieties of that A period, X period. And then the 19 on it, but these are fairly common, and you'll see that this thing is examined by the British and the French and the Germans. So it's been opened on both sides, and as well as passed through by the Germans. It's going to the Red Cross, so they're not bothering very much with it. Next.
So then, Rudy, question then, the lower left, passed by base 1107 Army Examiner. That's a British?
No, that could be American for all.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm just asking then. So then so there was another examiner. So everybody touched this. Okay.
Yeah. So everybody, I mean, you know, you have lots of POWs obviously in, you know, in North Africa, right?
Yes.
I mean, that was the, you know, first big test of American forces there. So next. Is that it? I can't remember.
That could be. Wait, I'm trying to advance. No, that's the last slide, Rudy. That's
okay. This is what I said about, I've got one for Y. Y is also scarce, and I have some, and to be honest with you, I had been looking high and low for it and had squirreled it away. But when I redo this, I'll do a Y. And a Y is also very scarce. It's a Bordeaux, and Bordeaux sits way in the west of France, and it didn't function very long. And then its function was moved further eastward. What's unique about those in some senses is they'll use cachets actually with field post numbers in them, which is the only place that did this. So that makes that the sealing strip has Ys, so those are available. But again, I'm getting too far into the weeds. I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, like I said, I'm just trying to present sort of a very high-level overview of all the variety in this collecting area. Yeah.
Well, Rudi, thank you. Let's have a round of applause for Rudi. That was fantastic. Look, we're getting a cheers here, Rudi. Thank you. That was great. Are there any questions? I know I probably should shut up because I had a few more, but let's open it up to the floor, please. Paul, I think I see your hand up.
Rudi, I remember hearing things. I don't know that much about censorship, but Sweden was somewhat of a conduit. We could send from neutral America or a war America to Sweden, then change it into another envelope and then send it to Germany or to France or.
Well, I think the mail to Sweden is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that if you sent an airmail, the Brits had a way of getting mail from Britain to Sweden without having Germans see it. And I think there are long stories about this, but they used some special small airplanes that essentially evaded the Luftwaffe, and they could actually get, so you will see mail to Sweden from the United States, and also some return that is not censored by the Germans. Surface stuff would have all been, or stuff, that went through Portugal, right? And then came up across the south of France to Munich and then would have gone up. The schemes that you're maybe thinking of, Paul, is there were letter schemes that censors allowed. The famous ones are the sardine covers or so-called sardine cards, secret addresses, primarily in Portugal. So there was an office, I think Thomas Cook, right? They had an office in Portugal. You sent it to an undercover address. They got it. They pasted an address in the UK on it. So essentially, you sent your mail to a neutral, and then you could send it on to an enemy country. Because remember that the Germans couldn't send mail directly to the United States anymore after 41 or to Britain. But you might get news to somebody in Britain if you had somebody you knew there by sending it to Portugal and having it remailed then to Britain. So those schemes existed, and I think, quite frankly, in my opinion, they were tolerated on both sides. I mean, it wasn't just tolerated by the Nazis, but it was also tolerated by the West. These make interesting stories, and I think in our magazine we've had various examples of that over the years. But anytime you find a card with a certain address, and there are a number of addresses, or maybe a card that actually uses the word sardines or thank you notes for sardines. Well, Portugal, interestingly enough, and I just did a study a little while ago of this, trying to track it down. I found out that the canned fish industry of Portugal grew astronomically in the Second World War. I mean, the number of exports to both the UK, but also to Germany, and I talked to a guy, I wrote exchange notes to a professor in Portugal who'd written a history of the canned fish industry of Portugal. And I said, well, how'd they finance this? I kind of guessed. And of course he said, Jewish gold, right? Think about that, right? I have a piece of mail out of Theresienstadt, which was the luxury camp, and it just has a little label on it, and it does have a censor marking on because packages were also censored, obviously, for contact, and so fish or sardines, I guess, were things that could be sent to people in Poland and other places, and they were luxury items, quite frankly, and so you see references to this, and I don't know, if you're lucky, you might actually find a card and you'll see, something to Switzerland that says, thank you for your 5 cans of sardines, right? And probably that's going to a Swiss cover address. And the Swiss then, I think Jewish aid organizations in Switzerland then sent money to Portugal for people to send cans from Portugal to Poland or to Theresienstadt or other places. But the Germans must have, I mean, clearly knew about this, you know. So, any other questions?
Any other questions? I know I have one more. Could you ask Rudi, and while we have others think, so just remind me, Munich was the only censorship station that crimped the paper from the examples you showed? There were others did, right? We just didn't see it on others, right? Is that true?
No, I mean, what I should say is that, you know, my own collection of World War II censors, probably is between, you know, 1,000 and 2,000 covers, you know, and I mean, and much of it is duplication. I just get rid of it, but you accumulate these things. I mean, I'm unfortunately an accumulator, so then I have lots.
Do you realize there's 30 accumulators that are here tonight on this particular call, and they're all laughing and shaking their heads because we all accumulate, Rudi. We have thousands of things that we don't know what to do with. That's why we're all here.
And the thing is, what's lovely about this kind of thing, you know, those items are all unique. They're all unique, right? They're all a little different, so I can justify purchasing another censorship cover because it's got this other tweak on it, right?
Rudi, we all have that gene, Rudi, and we all can justify the purchase, believe me.
Yeah, anyway, I'm in deep doo-doo with people in my household on this.
Oh, yeah. But so then Munich wasn't so the most of them also, if they didn't have the tape, they would use the tape and they would do the crimping of the paper. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think I would say crimping is probably less frequent.
Okay.
Most people use tape. The more desirable stuff obviously comes towards the end of the war. It's stuff that's not the normal tape, you know. Again, once you get into it, if you can identify it in terms of a given site and compare it to my list and saying, why is this going here? It shouldn't be. Well, like, I mean, the standard thing is, why is a letter, you know, to a law office in Munich going through Berlin? Well, because it's from patent attorneys, right? So they take various routes to get there. And some of this and part of the thing that I want to do, I think, is revamp the collection because I've got better examples. And also, I guess, I don't want to do it now, but if any of you have any recommendations, I think what I want to do in part is for this kind of presentation, to enlarge in each instance the size of the cachet so that you can see them all better. And
well, Rudi, what might be interesting is to just take all the cachets and crop them and put one slide that show each of them in order from A, B, C, D. You know what I mean? Just show them all lined up, and you would see the subtleties in each and each of the letters. That might be a really good slide to show the differences. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the catalog, I mean, or the standard book that I use, and I mentioned it. I don't know if you can see this, but this is just pass-through sense. Like this is ABs, right?
Yes.
And there are pages of these. How many different AB things can you have? And you know, the standard one, Berlin, all of the, I mean, it has so many, and they're described so in this thing, I was just trying to give an overview, but if you were into this, I would say you'd probably want to concentrate on one station. You know,
not like you, Rudi, right? But clearly, you know, folks should absolutely know your contact info. I mean, I want to see if there's any other questions, but if anybody's interested in this and don't know about the society and Rudi's role there as president and contact info, clearly.
Yeah. Paul's got my email address. I'd be happy to take questions on that, or certainly to get feedback from you as to how to improve the program. Because I'm not, the whole point of this is to share information from my part. I mean,
it was great, Rudy. Listen, great,
so-
Rudy. It was great, and I think we might have a few more questions. And if not, we could save a few for following up. But I'm just appreciating that you shared all of this, and at a high level, it definitely paints a picture. There's much interest there. I think each of us probably has a few of these at some point or sees them. Now, kind of, we know what to look for. And absolutely, your society and all the references are an invaluable tool if you want to really study this a bit more. Any other questions for Rudy, though, please? I want to make sure. Go ahead, Paul.
The GPS website is a link on our website under the resources.
Absolutely, it is correct. So on our links page, if you look under societies, you will see the link to the society.
I can, one more pitch. Also, we're doing a couple of things that people might be interested in. One of them is we're having a virtual discussion group, and that's listed on the APS site next to where you folks have a reference to what you're doing, that same place. And we're having the first one of those, I think, in July. I want to say July 23rd or something like this. We'll limit that probably to 100 folks, but the whole idea is kind of a big show and tell. And we'll get stuff beforehand and then discuss it, and we'll have that. And the other thing we're talking about doing with the APS and others is having a virtual stamp show. And we're in the process of getting judges, and we're trying to recruit exhibitors. And essentially we'll be handing out then awards in this virtual stamp show. I mean, it won't be authorized, but we'll have real judges, right? And the idea, I think, would be this would give collectors who are just starting an exhibit or are new at exhibiting a chance to kind of present it and get a critique, without spending an arm and a leg, right? And also experienced exhibitors, and we'll feature those exhibits there so that all collectors can essentially go to our website and see these exhibits. One of the features we're thinking of is just having kind of a popularity contest, but all of this is done because we're in a pandemic and we can't have stamp shows, right? And I, for one, like to go to stamp shows, and I like to, look at what people's creative juices have produced. I mean, it's wonderful to do that, but we can't do that now. So those are two things that we're working on, and we hope to have that virtual stamp show in September, October. But it'll be listed on the APS, site as well